Hello comrades, it's Comrade Ace here, and today I'm just going to be looking at the most common argument made by people who try to justify imperialism. And examples of people who defend imperialism would be the politicians in my country's government, the politicians in the US government, basically anybody running an imperialist country. But first of all, before I move on to the most common argument that you would hear, I'll just very briefly explain the Marxist-Leninist understanding of imperialism. A lot of people tend to think that all that there is to imperialism is simple military conquest, the building of an empire. But in the Marxist-Leninist understanding of the word, it actually means much more than that. Imperialism means taking over another country's natural resources, utilizing their cheap labour, and taking over their markets. Now notice how all of these actions are actually economic and political, not military. The only time imperialism would require military conquest and violence is if it cannot achieve these things in any other way. Keep in mind that military conquest is not really the point. It's only a means to an end. The ultimate goal is economic exploitation, and military conquest just facilitates this exploitation. For instance, the Western imperialist countries own most of the world's wealth. They exploit cheap third world labour. They dig minerals and oil from poor countries at very low prices, and they dominate the global markets. This is imperialism. Even though imperialism in itself is an economic activity, some imperialist countries do engage in constant imperialist wars to further their economic interests, most notably the United States of America and Britain. Now that all of you comrades know what imperialism actually is, let's go straight into the most common argument that you would hear people make to try and justify imperialism. This country safeguards human rights, democracy and freedom at home and abroad. When you're watching the news or watching bourgeois politicians get interviewed, or if you watch politicians from two bourgeois parties argue with each other over how they're going to spend your hard-earned cash on pointless shit to serve the capitalist class, like the royal family, or a second property, or an arms deal with another imperialist country, you would sometimes hear human rights, democracy and freedom being mentioned. However, you would hear this being used a lot more when there is talk of an imperialist war or sanctions against a socialist country like North Korea or Cuba, or an anti-imperialist country like Syria or Iran. The phony talk of human rights, democracy and freedom is where a lot of people get caught out and fooled, particularly when it's aimed at countries that are fighting against imperialism. However, by reading between the lines and looking hard enough, you will come to realize that the reason why bourgeois parties and bourgeois politicians keep saying this over and over again is because all they want to do is destabilize that country with sanction after sanction until their economy just goes to shit. They then blame that country's government for the poverty that they caused through the sanctions, and then what imperialist countries like my country or the United States in particular do is that they either fund coups within those countries or send working class soldiers to their deaths to invade those countries that fight against imperialism, to try and remove the leader of that country from power, to replace him with a puppet government, all to control that country's resources and markets. For example, what was Tony Blair's justification for invading Iraq and getting rid of Saddam Hussein?
On Tuesday night, I gave the order for British forces to take part in military action in Iraq. Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
There were countless stories of how Saddam Hussein was going to use his weapons of mass destruction against us. But it turned out Saddam Hussein didn't have bugger all. Even if Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that would be no reason to wage war against Iraq or any other country, because the countries that possess the greatest arsenal of these weapons are the United States, Britain, France, Russia and China. Now, I support universal, non-discriminant nuclear disarmament, but until we disarm, countries that fight against imperialism have as much right to have nuclear weapons as we do. When the United States wanted to invade Libya to get rid of Gaddafi, there were countless stories of how Gaddafi was raping women in his palace and how he was giving his soldiers Viagra to rape women. But there was no evidence for all of this. It was all to try and cover up what the United States really wanted to do, which was to bomb the shit out of Libya, replace Gaddafi with a US puppet government, and control Libya's resources and markets. That's all there is to it. Now, if you ask me, that's just fucking insidious. Another argument that was used to justify imperialism was 9/11. Now, I strongly believe that the US government and the CIA are to blame for 9/11, because we are all told about how the two planes crashed into the World Trade Center, but we are never told about the controlled demolitions and the missiles launched at the Pentagon, are we? Even if you say that the Afghan government did 9/11 for the sake of argument, that is no good reason. The United States of America has committed 9/11s on a scale far higher than any other country has committed. And why is this so? It is because the United States of America, or the so-called land of the free, goes around the world and bombs innocent people in order to control their country's resources and markets. And the imperialist countries just have this fucking nerve to turn around and say, oh, we're bringing democracy, support our troops, human rights. And there are people who watch the mainstream media who are just fucking gullible enough to fall for that bullshit. And it scares me. In fact, it terrifies me to see that a lot of people within the imperialist countries, particularly my country, they just don't give a shit. They just, oh, we love the royal family. Oh, we love the British government for being so democratic. We love to wave the Union Jack. Oh, there's the royal family. They're coming to see our school. But when you talk of what the ruling class of my country are really about, and about the crimes that they commit on a regular basis against the interests of the working class, people just look at you as if they just, people just look at you as if you've come out of a mental hospital. And do you know how that feels? It just feels fucking demoralising. And don't even get me started on liberals. Liberals and other first worldists annoy the fuck out of me, because they would quite happily call you a racist if you attack Barack Obama for invading Libya back in 2011. But unlike us third worldists, they haven't got their head around the correct revolutionary science. They don't look at a Marxist perspective of history or dialectical materialism. They just want to be on the side of the liberals and the social democrats, who actually serve the capitalists, by the way, but they say that they want to change the system. The first worldists never begin to think about attacking the politicians, the police or the military for suppressing working class uprisings. They are nothing like us third worldists, who actually want to change society for the benefit of the working people by grabbing a rifle and fighting against the government to make that change. This is why, as a third worldist Marxist-Leninist, and I'm sure many of you comrades know this feeling, because we've got our heads around the correct revolutionary science, because we understand dialectical materialism, and because we want to change society to serve the interests of ordinary working class people, we're the bad guys no matter what. But what about the people who are against the British government? What about people like you, Comrade Ace? Well, let me put something straight. The people who stand up for the interests of the working people. Yes, when I say working people, I do mean ordinary people like you and me. The very people who stand up against the British government in the interests of working class people. If they are organised into a movement and they protest on a street, my country's government sends the police and sometimes even the military to smash those protesters for challenging the system, or as the British government likes to call it, being terrorists. So to summarise, comrades, when you hear bourgeois parties and bourgeois politicians talk of bringing human rights and democracy, don't fucking listen to them.